You can often recognize someone who grew up in the 1990s, even if they never say it out loud. They remember phone numbers that no longer exist. They can sit in silence without immediately reaching for their phone. And strangely, they seem comfortable living both online and offline. But the most interesting thing about them is this. They remember a world that moved slower, a world where people weren't constantly connected. And that experience shaped their psychology in ways many people don't realize. Because growing up in the 1990s meant something unique. It meant witnessing the moment when human life quietly transformed from analog to digital. And when a generation grows up during that kind of transition, it changes how they think, how they socialize, and even how they understand themselves. To understand the psychology of people who grew up in the 1990s, you have to imagine everyday life before the internet fully took over. If you wanted to talk to a friend, you called their house phone. And sometimes their parents answered first. If you wanted to meet someone, you made plans ahead of time. Once you left the house, there was no way to send a quick message saying you were late. You just hoped the other person would show up. If you missed your favorite TV show, there was no streaming service waiting for you later. You had to catch it when it aired. Information wasn't instant. Entertainment wasn't endless. And boredom wasn't something people tried to eliminate. It was simply part of growing up. Children spent long afternoons figuring out how to entertain themselves. Riding bikes around the neighborhood, exploring nearby parks, inventing games with friends. Sitting in their room imagining stories. At the time, it didn't seem unusual. But psychologically, that environment shaped how their brains developed. Because when the mind isn't constantly consuming stimulation, it learns to generate its own. Psychologists have long studied the role of boredom in creativity and problem-solving. When the brain has nothing immediate to focus on, something interesting happens. It begins to wander. Ideas form, questions appear, connections between thoughts begin to emerge. Many of the creative and reflective habits people carry into adulthood begin in those quiet moments, and people who grew up in the 1990s experienced a lot of them. But then, slowly at first and then very quickly, the world began to change. Computers started appearing in homes, the internet arrived, email replaced letters, instant messaging replaced waiting, and suddenly, the rhythm of life accelerated. For the first time in human history, communication became almost instant. Information became unlimited. Entertainment became available at any moment. For people who were children during the 1990s, this transformation happened during the most important stage of psychological development. Their childhood brains learned patience, but their teenage and adult lives required speed, and this created something fascinating. They became mentally adapted to two completely different worlds, one that valued waiting and one that expected immediacy. Psychologists sometimes refer to this kind of experience as a transitional generation effect. When people grow up during a massive cultural shift, their minds become unusually flexible. They develop the ability to understand both systems. People who grew up in the 1990s know how to function in the digital world. They use smartphones. They navigate social media. They work in environments shaped by technology. But at the same time, they remember something many younger generations never experienced: life without constant connectivity. And that memory quietly influences their behavior today. For example, many people who grew up in the 1990s are comfortable being unreachable for a while. They can leave their phone in another room. They can go for a walk without checking notifications. They can sit through a quiet moment without feeling the need to fill it with digital noise. This isn't because they dislike technology, it's because their brain developed before constant stimulation became the default, and the nervous system remembers that slower rhythm. You can also see this difference in how they experience privacy. Think about childhood in the 1990s. Embarrassing moments weren't recorded on smartphones. Arguments with friends weren't posted online. Mistakes happened. People laughed about them, and eventually the memory faded. But today, many experiences live permanently on the internet. Photos, videos, messages, screenshots. For people who grew up before social media became dominant, this change feels significant. They remember what it was like when life wasn't constantly documented, which is why many of them are more cautious about what they share online. They understand the internet, but they also remember a time when personal experiences stayed personal. Another fascinating psychological trait shaped by the 1990s environment is adaptability. Think about the number of technological transitions this generation experienced in a relatively short period of time. Cassette tapes turned into CDs. CDs turned into digital downloads. Downloads turned into streaming services. Dial-up internet turned into high-speed connections. Flip phones turned into smartphones. Each transition required people to learn new systems, new habits, new ways of communicating. And every time the environment changed, their brains had to adjust. This repeated adaptation created something powerful: mental flexibility. People who grew up in the 1990s often expect the world to evolve. They don't assume systems will remain the same forever. They've already lived through several major shifts, which makes them psychologically prepared for change. But this flexibility also creates an interesting tension. Because while they adapt easily, part of their mind still remembers the slower pace of the past. Imagine spending your childhood in a quiet neighborhood where evenings meant riding bikes until the streetlights came on. Then imagine growing into adulthood in a world filled with constant notifications, emails, and endless information streams. The contrast between those two experiences creates a unique emotional landscape. Many people from this generation appreciate the convenience of modern life. But they also feel something difficult to describe: a quiet nostalgia for a slower environment. Not necessarily better, just different. A world where attention wasn't constantly fragmented, where people disappeared for a few hours without explanation, where conversations happened face-to-face instead of through screens. And this memory shapes how they interact with modern technology. They use it, but they sometimes feel overwhelmed by it. You might notice someone scrolling through social media, then suddenly putting their phone down with a sigh, or leaving a group chat because the constant messages feel exhausting, or preferring long conversations in person rather than endless texting. This reaction isn't random. It reflects the difference between a brain trained in calm environments and a world that now demands constant attention. Another psychological trait common among people who grew up in the 1990s is comfort with uncertainty. In today's world, many people feel anxious if they can't instantly contact someone. If a message goes unanswered for an hour, the mind starts imagining explanations. But growing up in the 1990s meant living with a lot of uncertainty. If you called a friend and they weren't home, you simply waited. If someone said they'd meet you somewhere, you trusted they would appear. And if plans changed, you sometimes didn't know until much later. This environment trained the brain to tolerate the unknown. Temporary disconnection was normal. You didn't need constant updates. You trusted that things would work themselves out. That experience shaped how this generation relates to time and communication. They often don't require immediate responses. They're comfortable with pauses in conversations. They understand that people sometimes disappear for a while and then return. This tolerance for uncertainty is becoming increasingly rare in the digital age, but it's something many people from the 1990s carry naturally. And then there's boredom. In today's world, boredom has almost disappeared. The moment someone feels even slightly unstimulated, they open an app, watch a video, scroll through content. But people who grew up in the 1990s remember boredom differently. They remember long car rides staring out the window, waiting rooms with nothing to do, rainy afternoons with no entertainment except imagination. Those moments might seem insignificant, but they played an important role in mental development. When the brain isn't constantly consuming information, it begins producing thoughts, ideas form, creativity appears, self-reflection becomes possible. And many people who grew up in the 1990s learned to spend time inside their own minds. That habit stays with them, even in adulthood, which is why some of them still enjoy quiet activities like reading, walking alone, or simply sitting with their thoughts. Not because they reject modern life, but because their brain remembers how valuable mental space can be. And perhaps the most fascinating psychological feature of this generation is something that's difficult to measure: perspective. They remember what life felt like before the digital transformation, and they also live fully inside the modern connected world. They know the advantages of both: the convenience of instant information, the beauty of uninterrupted moments. They understand the benefits of technology, but they also understand the cost of constant distraction. That perspective makes them unusually aware of how fast the world has changed. And sometimes, when they look at the pace of modern life, they realize something surprising. The world they grew up in is now almost unrecognizable. Not because it disappeared overnight, but because technology quietly rewrote the rules of everyday life. And they were there for the moment it happened. So if you grew up in the 1990s, you might carry a mindset that feels slightly out of sync with the modern world. Part of you appreciates speed, connection, and endless information. But another part of you still values silence, patience, moments without interruption. And that doesn't make you outdated. It might actually make you uniquely prepared for the future. Because as the world continues to accelerate, the people who remember how to slow down may be the ones who understand balance the best.